In the winter of 1891, in the high plains of Wyoming, there lived a man named Thomas Whitfield who owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, a spread of land so vast that it took a rider 2 full days to cross it from one fence line to the other. Thomas was 38 years old, tall and quiet, with a kind of steady, watchful eyes that came from years of reading weather and cattle and men. He had inherited the ranch from his father, who had built it up from a single homestead claim into an empire of grass and cattle, and Thomas had spent his entire adult life proving himself worthy of that inheritance. But for all his wealth, Thomas carried a private wound that no amount of land could heal. Years earlier, he had been engaged to a woman named Isabel Carter, the daughter of a banker in Cheyenne, a beautiful and clever woman who had seemed, for a time, to love him deeply. But when a drought struck the territory and cattle prices collapsed for 2 devastating seasons, Isabel had quietly broken the engagement, marrying instead a railroad executive whose fortune had not been touched by the hardship. Thomas never spoke of it, but the betrayal settled into him like a stone, and in the years that followed he grew increasingly guarded, trusting his foreman and his cattle far more than he trusted the smiling faces of the women who came calling once his wealth became known. By the time he reached his late 30s, Thomas had resolved that if he was ever to marry, it would only be to a woman who loved him without knowing what he possessed. He confided this plan to no one but his old ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Ezra who had worked for Thomas's father before him, and who listened to the plan with a skeptical shake of his head but agreed, out of loyalty, to keep the ranch running smoothly in his absence. So it was that in the first cold weeks of November, Thomas Whitfield packed a single canvas bag with a few worn clothes, took only a modest sum of money, and set out on foot toward a small farming settlement called Aspen Hollow, nearly 40 miles from his own ranch, where no one would recognize his face or his name. He let his beard grow rough and unkempt, wore his oldest work clothes until they were stained and patched, and introduced himself in every town along the way as Tom Wilder, a drifting cowhand looking for work wherever he could find it, a man with nothing to his name but a strong back and a willingness to labor for his supper. Aspen Hollow was a small, hard-scrabble settlement of perhaps 30 families, scattered farms clinging to a narrow valley between 2 ridgelines, where the soil was thin and the winters were long and unforgiving. Thomas arrived there on a gray afternoon, his boots worn through at the soles, his stomach empty for 2 days, and he began asking at each farm he passed whether anyone needed an extra hand for the winter months in exchange for food and shelter. Most farms had no need of extra labor in the dead of winter, and several turned him away with suspicion, wary of strangers wandering into their small community. It was as the light was fading and the first flakes of an early snow began to drift down that Thomas came upon a modest farmhouse at the edge of the valley, its fences leaning, its barn roof patched with mismatched boards, smoke rising thin and gray from its chimney. A woman answered his knock, a widow named Sarah Coleman, perhaps 30 years old, with tired eyes and flour dusted across her apron, 2 children peering out from behind her skirts, a girl of about 10 clutching a worn book to her chest, and a younger boy of 6 holding a small carved wooden horse. Sarah's husband, a farmer named William Coleman, had died the previous spring when a fever swept through the valley, leaving her alone to manage the farm, the livestock, and 2 young children through the brutal Wyoming winters with no one to help her. Sarah studied the ragged stranger on her doorstep for a long moment, taking in his worn coat, his tired eyes, the heavy bundle slung over his shoulder that contained nothing more than a few spare clothes and a bedroll. She had little enough to spare for her own children, let alone a stranger, and every instinct told her to turn him away as she had turned away other drifters that autumn. But something in his manner, a certain quiet dignity beneath the exhaustion, made her hesitate. "I have no money to pay a hired hand," she told him plainly. "But I have a roof over the barn that keeps out most of the snow, and I can spare a plate of supper for a man willing to earn it by morning chores." Thomas, who had eaten nothing substantial in 2 days and whose feet ached from the long walk from his own ranch, accepted gratefully, and that evening he ate a simple meal of potatoes and salted pork at Sarah Coleman's table, surrounded by the quiet chatter of her 2 children, feeling a strange warmth settle over him that he had not felt in years, not since before his father's death. Not since before Isabel's betrayal had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. In the days that followed, Thomas, or Tom Wilder as Sarah knew him, proved himself an invaluable help around the failing farm. He repaired the sagging fences before the worst of the winter storms could widen the gaps, He split and stacked enough firewood to last well into the new year. He mended the barn roof with boards he fashioned himself from fallen timber. And he taught Sarah's young son, Daniel, how to properly care for the farm's aging horse, a task the boy had been too small and untrained to manage alone since his father's death. Sarah watched all of this with growing gratitude and a cautious, unspoken affection that she was careful not to name even to herself, for she had loved her husband deeply and did not know how to make room in her heart for the possibility of loving again, especially not a penniless drifter who might vanish with the spring thaw as easily as he had appeared with the first autumn snow. But Thomas found himself, evening after evening, drawn to the quiet warmth of the Coleman farmhouse, to the sound of Sarah's daughter Emily reading aloud from her worn book by the fire, to young Daniel's earnest questions about cattle and horses, to Sarah herself, whose exhaustion could not fully hide a sharp intelligence and a deep, weathered kindness that reminded Thomas of everything he had once hoped to find in a wife, and had long since given up expecting to find at all. Word of the drifter working at the widow Coleman's farm spread quickly through the small community of Aspen Hollow, as such things always did in settlements so small that little escaped notice. Some of the townsfolk regarded Thomas with suspicion, wondering what a grown man with no farm and no family of his own was doing spending his days laboring for a widow who could offer him nothing but meals and a place in the barn. A few of the more presumptuous women of the valley, upon meeting the ragged stranger at church one Sunday, dismissed him entirely once they learned he had no land, no herd, no prospects beyond his own two hands, treating him with the same cool indifference Thomas had once endured from women drawn only to the size of his cattle herds back in his true life. But Sarah never treated him with anything but plain, unadorned respect, thanking him sincerely for every repair, insisting he take a larger portion of the modest meals she prepared even when Thomas protested that her own children should eat first, mending the elbow of his worn coat by lamplight one evening without being asked, simply because she noticed it had begun to fray and could not bear to see a man go cold through a Wyoming winter for want of a needle and thread. As November gave way to December, the affection between them deepened slowly, carefully, the way trust grows between two people who have both been wounded before and are wary of being wounded again. Thomas learned the full story of William Coleman's death, of the desperate months that followed when Sarah had nearly lost the farm to debt, of her quiet, fierce determination to keep her children fed and clothed and educated despite having no family nearby to help shoulder the burden. Sarah, in turn, learned of the man Tom claimed to be, a wandering cowhand who had worked ranches from Texas to Montana, who spoke with unusual authority about cattle breeding and land management for a man who owned neither, details Thomas allowed to slip only because he found himself, against his own careful plan, unable to entirely hide the knowledge of a lifetime spent running the largest ranch in the territory. If Sarah noticed these inconsistencies, she said nothing, perhaps too exhausted by the demands of the farm and her grief to question too closely the good fortune of having found genuine help in a season when she had expected only to struggle alone. The true test of Thomas's disguise, and of the bond quietly forming between them, came in the third week of December, when the worst blizzard in a decade descended upon the valley without warning. It began as a heavy snow in the late afternoon, the kind of snowfall the valley had seen many times before, but by nightfall the wind had risen to a furious howl, driving the snow sideways in blinding sheets, burying the fence lines and the barn door under drifts taller than a grown man. Sarah's small herd of cattle, no more than a dozen animals that represented nearly everything of value the farm possessed, had not yet been moved to the shelter of the lower pasture where the ridge would break. The worst of the wind, and as the storm intensified, Sarah grew frantic with worry, knowing that without shelter the cattle could freeze or scatter and be lost entirely, a loss the farm could not survive. Thomas, without a moment's hesitation, wrapped himself in every layer of clothing he owned, tied a length of rope around his waist and secured the other end to the barn door so he would not lose his way back in the whiteout conditions, and went out alone into the screaming wind to drive the cattle to safety. For nearly 3 hours, in conditions that would have turned back even experienced ranch hands, Thomas fought through drifts and blinding snow, calling and pushing the terrified animals toward the shelter of the lower pasture, his hands growing numb, his face burning with cold, twice losing his footing on ice hidden beneath the snow and nearly losing the rope that was his only guide back to safety. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah kept a lantern burning in the window through the entire ordeal, praying with a desperation she had not felt since the night her husband's fever had finally broken him, terrified that she was about to lose not only her cattle but the man who had, without either of them quite naming it, become essential to her survival and, more quietly, to her heart. When Thomas finally stumbled back through the door well past midnight, half frozen, his eyebrows crusted with ice, his hands so numb he could barely work the latch, Sarah did not scold him for the danger he had risked. She simply pulled him inside, wrapped him in every blanket the house possessed, sat him before the fire, and held his frozen hands between her own until feeling slowly returned to them, tears running silently down her face at the thought of how close she had come to losing him, a realization that told her, with sudden and undeniable clarity, that whatever she felt for this ragged stranger had grown into something far deeper than gratitude. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, trapping them together in the farmhouse with the children, the world outside reduced to a howling white silence that pressed against the windows. In the quiet hours while Emily read to her younger brother by the fire, Sarah and Thomas sat together at the kitchen table, and for the first time Sarah allowed herself to speak plainly about her fear that she was betraying her late husband's memory by feeling anything at all for another man, and Thomas, moved by her honesty, found he could no longer bear the weight of his own deception. He told her everything. He told her his true name, told her about the vast ranch that lay 40 miles to the east, about the fortune he had hidden from her for nearly 2 months, about Isabel Carter and the wound that had led him to disguise himself in the first place, about the desperate hope that had driven him to walk into a stranger's life, hoping to find a love uncomplicated by the weight of his own wealth. He braced himself for her anger, for the accusation that he had made a fool of her, played some cruel game with a grieving widow's trust while she had opened her home and her heart to a man who did not exist. Sarah was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking, staring into the fire, and when she finally turned to face him, her eyes were not angry but searching, careful. The man who split my firewood and mended my son's understanding of horses and walked into a blizzard to save cattle that were never his to lose, that man was not a lie, she said slowly. I do not care how much land waits for you 40 miles from here. I care that you stayed when you could have walked away the moment the first snow made this farm too much trouble for a man passing through. I care that you never once looked at my children as burdens, and never once looked at me as anything less than capable, even when I was barely holding this farm together with my own 2 hands. She reached across the table and took his still healing hands in hers, the same hand she had warmed through that long, terrifying night, and told him that whatever fortune waited for him elsewhere changed nothing about what she had come to feel for the man who had shown up ragged and hungry at her door and had chosen, every single day since, to stay and to help without ever asking for anything in return. When the blizzard finally broke and the roads to Aspen Hollow became passable again, word soon spread through the valley of who the ragged drifter working the widow Coleman's farm truly was, and the same townsfolk who had once dismissed Tom Wilder as a penniless wanderer beneath their notice now scrambled to offer their congratulations and their sudden, transparent friendship to Sarah Coleman, soon to be mistress of the largest ranch in 3 counties. Sarah accepted these overtures with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else, neither bitter nor naive about what had changed in the town's regard for her, but never once forgetting who had stood beside her, and who had not, during the hardest season of her widowhood. Thomas brought Sarah and her 2 children to live at the Whitfield Ranch that spring, and true to the promise the blizzard had sealed between them, he never let his wealth change the plain, hard-working partnership they had built together in that small, struggling farmhouse. He kept the frayed, patched coat Sarah had mended for him that winter, storing it carefully as a reminder of the season when he had owned nothing but had never once felt richer, having finally found a love that had chosen him not for the size of his herds or the reach of his land, but for the simple, unadorned truth of who he was when he believed he had nothing at all to offer but his own 2 hands and a willingness to stay through the worst that winter could bring.